Hello, welcome to another amazing episode of the Power Podcast series brought to you by Nextier Power. I'm your host, IC Atiti. The aggregate technical, commercial, and collection losses in the distribution subsector are major contributors to the Nigeria electricity supply industry's liquidity crisis. These losses are caused by poor infrastructure, unavailability of meters, inefficient collections, among others. However, the growing urbanization in the country requires distribution companies to improve power supply to be able to service end-user customers, especially businesses that can afford to pay for power. To encourage this, the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission (NERC) released franchising guidelines in 2020. These guidelines allow a DisCo to enter into an agreement with a third party to permit the third party to perform some of the DisCo's functions within the DisCo's franchise areas. Today, my guest is Abigail Botsha, Head Marketing and Business Development, GVE Projects, and we're going to be discussing the prospects for sub-franchising in the DisCos. Welcome, Abigail. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So can you give an overview of how DisCo sub-franchising works?
Okay, so sub-franchising in this case is a relationship between a master sub-franchisee and a unit sub-franchisee. And in this case, the master sub-franchisee is the DisCo, and the unit sub-franchisees are the independent energy providers. Now, what happens is that the DisCos are supposed to sub-franchise a part or a portion of their franchise to these independent energy providers. As a result, due to NEC guidelines, it's stipulated that there is a contractual agreement between the DisCos and the independent energy providers. And it's not just a two-way thing. The guidelines stipulates that the end users be brought in, hence the need for a tripartite agreement. And this tripartite agreement ensures that the end users knows that there is a transfer of responsibilities to the independent energy providers. And in this case, it allows the three parties to come to the table, discuss the stipulations, responsibilities, and deliverables of all parties, agree, sign off, and take off on the process. So basically, that's how it works.
So since NERC released the guidelines, would you say franchising as a means to address the funding and infrastructure deficits in the distribution sector has been successful?
To that, I would say a yes and a no. A yes, because it has significantly improved funding in the space, and the guidelines are critical to investors releasing funds into the sector. I mean, no credible investor would want to put in its money where they're not sure of how the rules in that sector plays out. So these guidelines provide a level of comfort to investors, and it gives them a protection knowing that they're kind of the risks in wherever it is they intend to put their money, especially in this sector. And I would say a no, because the guidelines have some ambiguities. Off the top of my head, I can think of one. Say in this arrangement, the end user decides to pull out. What then happens? Are there scenarios to address this sort of situation? I don't think it is clearly spelled out in the guidelines. So these guidelines should be able to tie those loose ends, because when an investor knows that this arrangement is structured in a way where all parties are protected regardless of their buying or not, it gives them a level of comfort. And I think the guidelines need to address that loophole, and whatever loopholes may seem to prevent this scheme from taking off.
So what do you think are the current challenges to DisCo sub-franchising, and why do you think more DisCos aren't keen into it?
From my own end, I think it's a two-pronged approach. One is a lack of proper understanding of how the concept of sub-franchising works. And secondly, it's about having to find the right model that works. Most DisCos, I would say, do not properly understand the concept, and they would need to understand that from the aspect of the independent energy providers, they are not here to take business from the DisCos. It's totally far from it. Instead, it actually helps the DisCos to have a lot of increase in revenue. Giving an example from our pilot at the Wuse market, I mean, AEDC has been bold to say that there has been an increase in collection and in revenue, and that has happened because we've been able to work through a model that works and is mutually beneficial to all the parties involved. The DisCos, that's GVE being the mini-grid developer, and also the Wuse Market Traders Association. So just add to that, I mean, the DisCos stand to benefit a lot if they understand how it works and are patient enough to walk through a model that works for them, because sometimes it's not just about having a particular model and thinking it can suit all the scenarios. The models are unique and should be tailored specific to the different transactions. So if you're patient enough to walk through the models and pilot it and see how it performs, I think it will be a win-win scenario for all the parties involved.
So beyond the guideline models, is there any other additional model that you think should be explored?
Sure. I think the guideline model addresses the tripartite agreement model, where some pilots have recorded success and some unfortunately haven't. I feel alternative models can be introduced, say situations where you have an energy mix. So it's not just a tripartite agreement between three parties, but you have a mix of energy providers. Say you have solar and gas, because the end goal here is to ensure reliable power supply, and the end user has what they want. So it might seem a little bit complicated at first, but as I said earlier on, if there's patience to test the models and see what works, it can work. Basically, if we are also open to layering whatever formats we can on the existing model, it's something that is sure to work. Yeah, I believe it's something that can work.
So finally, do you think a franchising regulation, apart from the guidelines, would encourage investors' appetite in partaking in sub-franchising?
I strongly believe it will. Guidelines basically speak to best practices and behaviors, but regulations are like laws that have legal implications, where there are stipulations and repercussions. So the guidelines would help to provide a level of comfort for investors. No investor would want to stake its investments in a sector that they do not feel properly protected. But when the law is there and regulations are put in place, I think these investors can strongly throw in their weight behind into the sector, because the mini grid developers at the moment have limited resources, and we know this sector attracts a lot of funding, but this funding is subject to the laws that protect the investors. So if there is a regulation or a law in place, the guideline is a good step in the right direction, but a regulation would do more, and as I mentioned, will provide a level of comfort for the investors, and it would give them the openness and also the comfort knowing that if they do throw in their funds or their investments into this sector, it can actually work and they are fully protected.
Thank you very much, Abigail. It's been a very informative podcast. Thank you for being a guest.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening.